Right, what we're going to be looking at in this video is how we establish what country should produce what across the world. What we know is now that increasingly economies are engaged in international trade. So basically they are specialising in the production of a narrower range of goods and services. They're importing the things that they decide not to produce themselves. Okay, now to explain how we decide what country should produce, we look at two different theories. We look at absolute advantage, and we look at the theory of comparative advantage. Now, absolute advantage is the theory that people are generally able to grasp fairly quickly. Comparative advantage, developed by somebody called David Ricardo, is a much more complex theory which people generally take a bit longer to explain. But absolute advantage, let's start with the basic one first of all. Absolute advantage is simple. It's the assumption that one country can produce something at a lower cost than another. So in other words, why make it yourself where you can employ another economy across the world to make it for you at a lower cost and therefore lower price than what you can access. Now, to explain this using numbers, what we're going to do, we're going to make lots and lots of basic assumptions. And these are the assumptions that are built into the theory of comparative advantage. So what we're going to do, what we're going to assume is that all we have are two different countries. We're going to have the UK, and we're going to have our biggest trading partner, which is the USA. Okay, and what we're going to be looking at is a simple world where all that is produced in these two different countries are two goods. And the goods we're going to focus on is a car and TV. So all the resources in these countries are used to produce either cars or TVs. So everyone's wants and needs are satisfied simply from cars and TVs. So what I'm also going to assume is that the cars and TVs produced in these economies are homogeneous, they're identical. Okay, so people will have no preference for an American car over a British car, for example, and the same goes for British and American TVs. I'm also going to assume that there are no protectionist policies in place, so there's no trade restriction stopping these countries trading with each other. I'm also going to assume that transport costs are free, so goods can be traded over international borders across seas at zero transport costs. Of course, a lot of these assumptions are very inaccurate, but it's what makes our analysis a little bit simpler to look at. Now, what I'm going to look at is the time in hours required to make cars and TVs in these different countries. So what we're going to say is in the UK, to make one car, it will take 10 hours. TV will take 2 hours. In America, I'm going to assume 6 hours to make a car and 3 hours to make a TV. Now, if we just stick to absolute advantage then first of all, what we would say is that the UK has got the absolute advantage of making TVs. The Americans have absolute advantage at making cars. Why? Well, it's simple. In the UK, we can produce a TV in 2 hours, the Americans take 3. So if we assume the cost of factors of production to make TVs are identical in both countries, the UK can make TVs cheaper than the Americans can. In America, they can make cars quicker than the British can. So again, assuming that the cost of production are identical in both countries, the Brits should not be making cars. So in this world, what would start to happen is that the Americans would start to specialise in the production of cars, the Brits would start to specialise in TV manufacture. So resources in Britain would shift away from making cars towards TVs. In America, resources from TVs towards making cars. Okay, now what we can also look at though is the theory of comparative advantage. And this was invented, or created should I say, by David Ricardo. And his assumption is looking at relative opportunity cost. And the most simple way of looking at this is to think about the numbers that we've got. So let's start off with one car. So what you should remember is that opportunity cost is where it's what you lose by producing something else. Okay, so if you make a car You can make less TVs, you make TVs, you can make less cars, for example, in this example that we've used here. So let's look at the UK first of all. Now in the UK, for every car that's made, it's 10 hours lost. So if I was to do 10 hours divided by the 2 hours to make a TV, what it shows me that in the UK, for every car that we make, the opportunity cost would be 5 TVs lost. In the USA, 6 hours to make a car divided by the 3 hours to make a TV, and it's 2 TVs. Okay, so when we look at this, then the UK loses the most by making cars. So what this means is that the Americans have got the comparative advantage in car production. They give up the least amount of TVs to make cars than what the Brits do. Now in the UK, all the way around, 1 TV. Okay, so this time if I do 2 divided by 10, and what I'm going to get this time is that in the UK, the relative opportunity cost is 0.2 cars. So for every TV that's made, we lose 0.2 cars in effect. In America, I do the 3 divided by the 6, and we get 0.5 cars. So what this shows is the UK has got the comparative advantage in TV production. We give up less cars to make TVs than what the Americans do. Okay, now we can also think about this using a production possibility frontier. So let's think about this now. So what I'm going to assume now is that again we've got 2 different countries. We've got the UK, let's call it economy A, and we've got the US, which is economy B. Let's draw the production possibility frontier. So I'm going to assume that in Britain we can produce goods and or services. If we use all of our resources to produce goods, we can make 60. All of our resources to make services, we can make 30. Okay, so there you go. In America, all the resources to make services, 60. Goods, 30. Again, what I'm assuming is that in these 2 countries we have equal access to resources, if you like. And the only difference is what we can see is the UK appear to have the advantage in goods, whereas the US seems to have the advantage in making services. Right, now what we can now think about is how we can change these production possibility frontiers. Now what we can do is now to add a new line to these production possibility frontiers. Now what we know is at the moment in the UK, for every 1 good that is produced, we sacrifice 0.5 services. In America, for every 1 good that is produced, they sacrifice 2 services. Okay, so what we would say is, based on this then, is that the Americans appear to have the advantage at making service. But let's add one more thing to this. In the UK, for every service that is made, we sacrifice 2 goods. Whereas in America, for every 1 service that's made, they sacrifice 0.5 goods. Okay, so look at this then. Who loses the least by making services? It's the Americans. They only lose 0.5 goods to make us, where the UK will lose 2 goods. When it comes to making goods, the UK has got the comparative advantage. We lose less services than what the Americans do. So what we would say is then, based on this, the UK should, as much as possible, specialise in making goods. The more goods, the better. The Americans should specialise in making services. Now think about this at the moment. If the UK were to make 60 goods, then their opportunity cost would be 30 services. But let's imagine now that what we do, we establish a terms of trade. In other words, the rate at which these two countries should be exchanging things with each other. And let's imagine that the leaders of both countries establish this. One good equals one service. So think about what that means now. If the UK completely specialised in making goods, we could trade those 60 goods to buy 60 services. And we call this our TPC, our Trading Possibility Curve. So what it shows is now that the UK can now access more goods and services. The Americans could specialise completely in making 60 services and use these to buy 60 goods. So again, what they have got is a much bigger, in effect, production possibility frontier. They can access more goods and services, which in theory should boost the level of economic welfare in both countries. Now what we can also do is to see this on one diagram. So again, let's think about goods and services. The UK's was like this one here. The Americans was like this one here. But by trading together, then the trading possibility curve of both countries is now further outwards. So the overall benefit of trade is that countries can access a bigger number of goods and services.